Ask the interpolation again then.
Okay, what happens if you have two segments which cross, and at the point that they cross, the linear interpolation along each segment doesn't yield the same result?
You have that's a scan line. That's a pixel. You have got one polygon crossing like this. One edge. And then you have another one going like this.
It's the same polygon.
No, they're different. They're two different polygons.
No, they may be the same polygon, but we have values associated with the vertices for things like intensities, right? And we're supposed to do continuous shading with linear interpolation.
Right.
We're supposed to interpolate along the lines.
You got one polygon that's got an edge crossing in this same guy here. Well, if you've got a twisted polygon and you look at it on its side, which can happen, you get something like that, right? You have then got an object which is mathematically ill-defined. And a lot of different people's algorithms screw up on that. In fact, I'm not giving anybody's algorithm, unless they turn it into a mathematical bilinear patch, then it will screw up in some way. And I can put in shading values. Punt. All right. In fact, for one hidden service algorithm I did, I went through a preprocessor, and the preprocessor checked for crossing, and if it crossed, then it split it up into polygons, because it is not a nice situation. And if your data comes from something that is measured, then it is very difficult to guarantee that they are collinear, unless you triangulate everything. And triangulating everything means that you double the amount of data. So it's not, in general, it's not easy. The more planar, the better. In fact, in the original Watkins algorithm, an edge was, they were linked together, so you had a leading edge and a trailing edge. Well, when they crossed, the leading edge came after the trailing edge, and the result was this thing disappeared. It was a hole. So that particular one is not really an aliasing problem. It's just it's a geometric one having to do with the algorithm. Okay, I went on this trip to Washington last week, and one of the best things about the trip was I had 2 uninterrupted days, namely on the plane out to Washington and on the plane back from Washington, where I could just read. So I took stacks of papers and documents and work-related things that I had to read. Didn't get any magazines or books or other frivolous things that waste time, which I usually do, and just read those. One of the papers I read was that by the fellow who has got the algorithm which he claimed was a linear growth algorithm in the last SIG graph. Well, he had pictures with that, and yes, it was a linear growth algorithm, but in order for the algorithm to be linear, he had some restrictions placed on it. And one of the restrictions was that the projected image of all the polygons, or whatever the things were, would be approximately the same size. Sure enough, in his pictures, there were pictures of lots of spheres that were all the same size, or another one, they were rectangles all the same size. And that, in general, is not, it's too restricting of a restriction. It doesn't lend itself to an interesting enough class of pictures. That's the main problem with it. And then I read a couple of the papers on the ray tracing. And I hadn't really thought about it before until I read this paper again. And the paper, they claimed that it was a linear growth algorithm. And it caught me off guard, because I know that it takes an awful long time to compute those pictures. But sure enough, it is linear growth. If you take the worst way of doing that algorithm, namely you for every pixel on the screen, you take a ray from the eye and you go out and you see, you compare against every polygon to see if you intersect the ray. Well, that's linear growth, because if you add, if you've got n polygons and you add one, then the number of extra comparisons that you've got to make as a result of that additional polygon is 512 squared, and it's 250,000 comparisons. So every time you add a polygon, you add 250,000 comparisons. But it is a linear growth algorithm.
Big constant, giant.
Yes, with a giant constant.
So the problem with the first one was it was useless, and the problem with this one?
Well, almost, I wouldn't say useless. There is a value to each of these, in that since the perfect algorithm has not yet been designed. If you look at enough of these, somebody might pick out the right subset or the right nifty little idea. There may be something in that first algorithm that lets you sort things in a new way. There may be, in fact, there are other ways of doing ray tracing which cut down substantially on the number of comparisons you've got to make. There are all these darn trade-offs. You're always making trade-offs. If you do ray tracing in image space, for instance, then you've got the problem that objects that are out of the image space can cast shadows into the image space. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 people. Okay, so that's what we're left with, and it's 14, and the rest of the people, I presume, are either auditing or whatever. 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Okay, I'll have to catch them next time, because there are 25 people here.
Next time it'll be too late.
No, it's their foul-up. That's what Vicki said. They're the ones that are slow. So if somebody's late, then we'll still get everything squared away. All right. Any other questions on the hidden service algorithms before we advance to the next topic, which is substantially different? None. Today we're going to talk about hardware. Where are my notes on hardware? Did I? Oh, nuts. All right, it's wing it time. I can't believe I did this. I did it. All right. C'est la vie. All right. Raster scan hardware. The first and most important, no, excuse me, the first device we'll talk about is the Framebuffer. The Framebuffer was an idea that was a natural one, given lots of memory. Before the memory was available or cheap, people were thinking of it. And in fact, the first Framebuffers were put together in some ad hoc ways. Let's see, Ramtech is an example, was a company that's, I think they're the biggest seller of Framebuffers. I actually don't like anything that they do, but they've been very successful with their stuff, and they were the first ones to come out, not one of the first, they were one of the first, using CCD linear arrays to store the image. Because at the time, they were quite cheap. Pardon?
What's CCD?
Well, at the time, they were using these chips where you had these cells in them, and you could store digital data, but you had to pipeline the data in. You put it in this end, and you had to keep it revolving around. And only when it came out the end could you actually look at it. And it was much cheaper than RAM memory. But the problem with those devices was always that by the time they actually got the thing built and manufactured, the RAMs were at the same cost. But the CCDs were still lower, but the way things kept going, they finally they got wiped out. RAMs were too good. But in the interim, there are memories built around these things. Some people built the frame buffers on disk, and disk amounted to the same thing. You had the image of the picture there on the disk. And then a few people, and this is what I did at Utah, just simulated it by paging it onto a disk. And there was no attempt to display out of it. One of the early frame buffers was that done at Xerox PARC by Dick Schaup. He used the CCDs. He was the first person to actually make a paint program. And it was on that paint program that Alvy Ray Smith got introduced to computer graphics and the color. The first good frame buffer to be built for computer graphics was done by the Evans and Sutherland company, and the person who designed the concepts for it was Ivan Sutherland. He designed it, and they sold, where did they sell? They sold the first one to Utah. And about that time, I was starting up at New York Tech, and we bought a frame buffer from them. Now, what made this frame buffer different was that it had a nice direct access to PDP-11. Now, I should hedge in one thing. There were some other frame buffers being built in other industries, like the television industry, for special purpose, but they were not useful for graphics. In any case, he had this large frame buffer, which was 512 by 512 by 8 bits. And here's a PDP-11, with its unibus. And then there was a memory mapping device between the memory and the unibus. And this could map, take a 4K section out of here and map it onto the unibus. And there were 8 mapping registers, so you could map up to 8 or 32K in here, although typically you wouldn't do that. You would take a 4K window. Now, a 4K window is equivalent to 16 lines in the frame buffer. So while you worked on that frame buffer, those lines look like PDP-11 memory. So it's very fast access. So we had paint programs and various display algorithms running in that frame buffer. But it was awkward to use in that you had to keep checking to determine if you were passing into a different 16 lines, and therefore you had to change the mapping register. So it was an annoyance. But our software to that point was convincing to the people we were working for. So the decision was made to buy 5 more frame buffers from ENS for a total of 6. And at that time, it was unheard of that anybody would have so many frame buffers. It's actually still quite rare. However, if they were to build this frame buffer for us, we wanted a new kind of interface. Instead of having this interface, we wanted a, scratch theirs, we wanted a frame buffer to unibus interface. And what this looked like on the unibus was 4 registers. The first register, let's call status. I'll explain that in a minute. The second one is X, third is Y, and the last one is data. So you could write in an X and a Y, and then you could read or write a byte or a word, and it would come from the right place in the memory. So you set any XY you want, and then you could just read the pixel, which is typically what happened, and that's it. It's read in the register. You can do arithmetic on it. Anything you could do to any other memory location on the PDP-11. And if you were doing wholesale transfers, you wanted to move things around quickly, you'd take a word at a time. The purpose of the status was to make it so that if you have this bit set, whenever you did an access, X was automatically incremented or decremented. So if you were writing a scan line, you could just set up the X and the Y to be what you wanted, and then you could just go right. And it was very fast.
There was another command.
No, there's no command
Okay.
at all. This status said whether or not you increment or decrement. That's it. And it was as simple as that. All right. What could be simpler? They built the thing for us then, and it wasn't particularly difficult. Although within their company, they called this thing the FB Uni, and they never heard us say it. They just saw it written there, and so to them it was the F Bunny. And we kind of liked that, and so pretty soon the F got dropped, and it was known as the Bunny. So at New York Tech, to get a bunny meant you called the snare program, and so forth. Now, in fact, at Lucasfilm, we're having new interfaces being built for us by the company that we're working with, so we're going to call it a Looney. But it's a different setup of register since we have 32 bits per pixel instead of 8. Yes?
You once said that when people build you a frame buffer that's square, they're not doing you a favor.
Did I say that?
I thought it was you because the TV interface is always 512 by 480 something.
Okay, well, there's a whole lot of words to say about that, so let me put that off for a bit. But don't let me forget about it, because in fact that wasn't one of the things in my note, but there are a lot of things to be said. Anyway, this interface was built, and then we wrote our algorithms in it, and everything went zipping along real fast. Now, during this period of time, and it's still true, we had a number of discussions with other people about how to interface to frame buffers. Most of the world believes that the way you interface to frame buffers is with DMA. That's one notion. The other notion is that frame buffers ought to be built with bit planes. But for many who are building bit planes, those bit planes are visible to the user. So if you write 16 bits, they're written in funny locations in the memory. And their way of making it so that it's easy for the user is to put in a little microcomputer inside the frame buffer to straighten out all the bits for you so things happen in the right way. And each of the people who have these various opinions would then discuss with us, because we're a fairly visible place, about the right way to do it. And I recall at the time that MIT had built their own frame buffer, and they had a microprogrammable processor in there. And one of the things they implemented was a fill algorithm. Did Albie talk about the fill algorithm? Okay, but somehow we should go into detail on how that works. We won't today, though. Our fill algorithm was written in assembly language on the PDP-11. Theirs was written in the microcode of this 170 nanosecond thing, and which also worried about the bit planes. Our program was much, much faster than their program. And the reason it was much, much faster is because the way the memory is organized. Now, as far as the DMAs, the main problem, now this is an opinion, but the companies who were making frame buffers had previously been building them out of CCDs and various things like that for the government. So the government's got frame buffers, and the government wants more frame buffers. Now suddenly RAM is cheaper. So the government draws up a spec. And what do they spec out? They spec out these old CCD things. So the new companies build the frame buffers, put RAMs in them, and make them look like shift register memories. And that's exactly what happened. That's what most of them did. And they vigorously defended that as being the right way to do it. That's the way you talk with it, is with a DMA of a scan line at a time. And I recall someone who had one of those frame buffers defending that as being the right way because DMA is so fast. And then he demonstrated his little program, which had to do a read, modify, write. And it's written in Fortran. And it was terrible. And having gone through this big, long argument about the why it should be this way, he would then have this apology of how we had to go through Fortran I/O, and he had to do this and this and this and this. That was a waste of his time, because he's spending time trying to make it faster, trying to get around the fact that it's so slow, when in fact with something like this, you can think more about your algorithms. You're not worried about trying to trick the system into being faster with your data. The problem with the DMA, incidentally, is that if you are in a time-sharing environment, and frequently people are with frame buffers, you can't initiate the DMA yourself. You have to let the operating system do it. It's not safe for you to do it. And anytime you ask the operating system to do anything for you, you're dead, if you've got to do it lots of times. All right. This device is actually mapped into the user space, and there's nothing here that can go wrong. There's no bad data I can put in there which is going to screw up anybody else. It can only screw up my own picture. That's the chief fault with the DMA. There are reasons for wanting a DMA, obviously, but for people who are writing programs, it's so much easier to have a direct access to the memory. Go ahead.
Question about yet another technique. Now that we have, single processor chips with 32-bit addresses, or at least 24 bits at the moment, what about a scheme in which you simply put the bitmap directly, it looks like it's just directly totally on the memory and inside the user space, and you could use the auto-increment and auto-decrement modes of the processor to go through, or use a block move to simulate DMA, or whichever.
That's right. For instance, you can do that on the VAX, and it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. You do have to go through a stage, which is really a fairly trivial stage, in some cases, of doing the XY mapping, but that's certainly not difficult. And for a lot of algorithms, that's a good way to go, nice and convenient. You can't display it typically, and for some applications, we need to see the display, then that's not quite appropriate. But for a hidden service algorithm where you don't really care until it's done, then that may be right, because at the end you can then transfer it over to a device where you can see the thing. So that's perfectly natural. In fact, in some of the large frame buffers now, they have got a microprogrammable processor within it, which has got, obviously, access to the entire displayed memory. Let's see. There's another notion, too, along the same lines. And that was that the manufacturers feel that most people who are doing image processing are working in scanline order, and they don't want anything or need anything that's not in scanline order, and therefore they don't need anything better than DMA. They don't need direct access. Well, that cuts both ways. One of the reasons these people may not need it or want it is that it's not practical. They can't think beyond it. All their algorithms have got to be in scanline order, so they think in scanline order. But that's not necessarily the best. You may come up with an algorithm which is better put into a local region. People rarely go in random order, but there's a local region which is not in scanline order. Well, you prohibit them from having that. You make it harder to think about certain kinds of problems. In general, I didn't get a high opinion of manufacturers during this whole process. Their attitude was that since we were just a bunch of computer scientists off in the esoteric world of making advanced computer graphics, it didn't really apply to their normal everyday users. Well, it's nonsense. The stuff we're doing is going to filter down to people doing more common applications, and that's the way things typically work anyway. And sure enough, 3 or 4 years later, they're now starting to put in the right kind of interfaces. But it didn't need to take 6 years. It could have taken 1.5 years or 2 years. It could have been right the first time, because there was already a couple of places doing it right. Well, that's more of a harangue against the way most people do things. I just feel more strongly about it because I went through this hassle with them. Now, with our current frame buffer that we're having, we've already got the frame buffer, but we don't have our Looney yet. There's more data because we've got the 4 components of the color. And then there is one other operation that happens so commonly that we desire to have it in hardware, and that is that the new data that you're putting in, you would frequently like to mix with the data that's already there. That is an alpha mix, which I think Alvy may have talked about last week. And the only reason you would want that is that you're in a painting system where you need the very fast response. There are places where they're putting the Z compare of a Z frame buffer into it. Now, I find that a little bit more questionable. And the reason is that in the case of a hidden service algorithm, most of your time is spent with intensity calculation, and the amount that you're going to gain from a Z compare in the hardware in that case is small compared to the total. Whereas if you're painting things where you're laying them down as fast as you can, then everything does count in your loop. So they're just you just have to be reasonable about what you're putting into the hardware. One could easily make this hardware so that it gets out of bounds as its own processor, and pretty soon you've got a computer in here. And that's, I guess Nelson talked about that last week, or you probably talked about in other computer science courses, the wheel of reincarnation. Frequently, you go through this in computer graphics where you've got the main computer and then this little device which handles the graphics for you. Well, it'd be nice if this thing could do a little bit more. And in fact, it'd be nice if it were programmable, right? Well, pretty soon, you've got a real computer here. And the real computer, of course, has got a little interface to make the final access to the frame buffer easy. That really happens. The newest picture system, for instance, is a multiprocessor. Actually, I haven't looked at it closely. I shouldn't say too much. Go ahead.
Does the Stanford very large-scale project fit in there, where they have this so-called geometry engine?
Well, the geometry engine itself is just is really a dot product chip, which is programmable. And there's another project that's going on that's related to it, which has got in it a raster converter. It doesn't really fit within this. That is, it's not. The frame buffer there would be part of a double buffering device, and it's a little early to tell how that's going to go. They're in talking about commercializing that geometry engine. The prices they're talking about are not substantially better, and the performance is not substantially better than current devices which don't use such a chip. So it's a little unclear what's going to happen there right now. All right, now, leaving the interfaces for a while, let's talk about the frame buffer itself, the display. We've got this memory with a video port coming out of it. I've seen frame buffers, and still being made nowadays, where if you make some sudden change to the memory or you change modes and you can see a glitch in the picture, the better frame buffer manufacturers never have glitches in the pictures. This thing always refreshes. And the worst that you can do, you can turn it off, or you might change the parameters, but as you're changing data, you should never see anything in the picture. Now, what is the size of the memories? Well, a typical one is 512 by 512 by 8, and sometimes more. There's one of them is 27 bits. I don't know where the 27 comes from. Some are 32. We have one that's 32. There's some which are 640 by 480, which gives you a rectangular picture, but every pixel is square. And then there are frame buffers out now which are really 1024 squared. And in fact, what we have with ours is 2 frame buffers, 512 by 512 by 32 bits, but they're in the same chassis with the same controller, and they can just be, under program control, changed into a 1,000-line by 16-bit picture, except that 16 bits is not enough to do anything interesting. So it's, and also we don't have a 1,000-line monitor, so we probably will not take advantage of that. That remains to be seen. Now the aspect ratio. Go ahead.
Are you saying then that you don't think a 1,000-line monitor has much use in
No, we couldn't afford it.
Okay.
Oh, I would love to have a 1,000-line monitor with it, but it's like another $9,000 or $10,000, and we do have budget. Contrary to popular opinion, we have budget restrictions. Even 7,500 is still. We haven't budgeted any money for it. Now, our first reaction was that to this aspect ratio was that it is a pain in the neck to have non-square pixels. Now, these things are displayed on television monitor. Well, the television screen has got an aspect ratio which is 3:4. Now, if you ever get a Framebuffer, you should get one where you can underscan the monitor, because most monitors come with overscan. You need one that's RGB and underscan, and those monitors are at least $3,000, I think, and a good one is more like $6,000 or $7,000. Oh, you can see everything in your picture, top and bottom line, left and right side, as opposed to your home television, which is overscanned, and you lose some of the picture. And every television I've ever had, because I've always been too poor to buy a decent television, is so much overscanned that you can't read some things which are up on the screen. Well, in fact, my last television with Heathkit, I want to put it together myself so that I would have control over the knobs. Well, the horizontal overscan was buried in a module which was pre-assembled, so it still was overscanned, and the damn thing never worked right anyway. And no, this was not Radio Shack. This is Heathkit?
No, they haven't been bought out. No.
Well, anyway, it was a bust. And it costs more than a regular television. Now, there are standards on what goes in the video signal. The standards are called RS-170A, unless they've got a new one nowadays. Now, most of you are familiar. There's on a video scan line, excuse me, on a video signal, you've got some signal having to do with the vertical retrace, and you've got a color burst, and then you've got the data on the line, and then you've got a blank signal, and so on to the next scan line. This blanking signal is supposed to be something like 10.6 microseconds. I'm not sure exactly. And the vertical retracing is a certain amount of time. And if you follow all those standards, the number of scan lines that you get on the image is something like 483 and a half. Now, a lot of the early Framebuffer manufacturers they didn't even worry about that standard. They just put up a signal. I think most of them now have got the capability of adhering to the standard, because there are several customers that do require that they meet it. For one thing, you cannot broadcast it if you don't adhere to the standard. And the FCC, of course, has got the power over the licenses, and therefore the major networks won't accept the material from you unless your signal is nice and clean. All right, 483 lines, or 484, 486, it all depends who you talk to. I always find the thing a little bit confusing. And a 4:3 aspect ratio. Well, for the most part, if you consider that 480, then that means that the aspect ratio of your pixel, since we get 480 by 512, fitting into a 3:4 aspect ratio means that a pixel is 5:8, roughly, on that system. Now, where we are now, we have to worry about film aspect ratio, which is a different aspect ratio still. And plus, there's the regular release film, there's anamorphic film, there's VistaVision, which is 2:1. And so what we have done is said, forget it. Let us live with the reality of the situation, and that is, you can't count on a square pixel. So don't bother. It isn't that hard to scale in the X and the Y direction. It's not that big of a hassle, but it is something you do have to think about, unfortunately. Now, did that answer your questions? Or your questions, about the aspect ratio?
Question about TV is 483. Are they doing you a favor when you make the square pixel?
Well, if you're in a lockdown situation where you know that your image is always fit in a certain format, then it's easier to have a square pixel. Because you've got 483 by 640. I mean, that's the notion of 480 by 640 in these other buffers, is you do have square pixels. And it makes it easier to think about. But on the other hand, you don't have a square picture anymore. You've got a rectangular picture. Somewhere, you got to eat it. All right, it catches up with you at some point.
Apparently those barcode monitors like we have in the AED, there's switches in there where you can actually change the width on the screen independent of the software, so you can get square pixels and square images and other funny stuff.
Yeah, I don't know which one you've got, but the one we had, there's an underscan and overscan mode, and plus there are the regular adjustments anyway on the Y and X deflection.
This has got a multi-position switch and it just keeps changing the width of the picture.
Okay. So somebody will come and leave it the wrong setting for you and they're not square anymore. As long as you're pretty close, it's hard to tell. All right, let's see, what else on frame buffers? One of the problems, incidentally, with the bunny sort of interface is there are some computers that don't let you map into the user's address space. I forget which ones they are, though. I've talked with a few people that were unable to do that. Go ahead.
Just a technical thing is the PDP-11's memory mapper won't let you map fewer than 63 bytes at once.
That's correct.
So you can't put these devices closer than 63 bytes to each other if you have more than one on the bus.
That's right. No, that is correct. We had them separated by 64 bytes. And on the VAX, there was no problem. Again, we just mapped it into the user's address space. In fact, when I went back to Washington, I dropped into Ohio State, where they've got a VAX and frame buffers, but they don't have a system programmer, and they were bemoaning the fact that they couldn't map. It was impossible, they said, to map it into the user's address space.
What operating system?
Unix. But in fact, it is possible in either one. It's just a matter of having somebody who knows how to do it. But what is it? It's Prime or one of those where you can't do that. I've been with DEC machinery too long. Okay, let's see. What else about the frame buffer? Well, when we bought our first frame buffer, it was $80,000. And the next 5 were $60,000 each. Again, these are all 8 bits per pixel. The AED are, what, roughly $10,000? They're not really solid pieces of machinery.
$7,500 for the box.
$7,500 for the box. And you need a monitor, and does that include the chips?
No.
No?
7,500 bucks for a quarter of a megabyte, a keyboard, joystick, and all the rest of the crap.
Megabyte of RAM goes for $1,000 now.
Megabyte of RAM goes for $1,000 bucks.
So yeah, it was 4 months ago we were negotiating a contract, and the contract had the chips, the 64K chips at $80 in the thing, and we were certain the prices were going to drop. In fact, in the mail today we got a whole pack of 64K RAMs for $15 each. So, but in fact, well, we'd heard they're going to be that low, but we actually have them in for that price now. In any case, moving right along. Okay, let's see. Next piece of hardware are film recorders. Let's spend some time talking about film recorders. Film recorders go through a range. There's the high end, and these cost $170,000 roughly. They're precision CRTs. They've got color filter wheels in them, but going between the phosphor and the camera. which usually holds some sort of slide or movie film. Two companies that make these are Excelco in New Jersey and Dycomed in Minnesota. They sell a lot of these to the government. Each of them, I think, has got a low-end or a cheaper version. You see lots of ERTS photographs being done on this. There's so many of these devices which are out doing these ERTS photographs.
What's an ERTS photograph?
Earth Resources Technology.
Technology set.
Yeah. The satellite's taking pictures. You've seen the pictures of Boston and Long Island and so forth, and the Bay Area in pseudo-color, red. They like red for some reason. And hanging up on people's walls. Now, well, a little more word about this. These vary substantially in their technology. In both cases, you've got this precision CRT, which is a perfectly flat face. It's not bent around. The Dycomed scans out the raster. At every pixel, it turns the beam on, and there's one intensity. So we vary the time that the beam is left on. So if you want it black, then you don't turn it on. If you want it just dark, you turn it on briefly. And for white, you leave it on for a long period of time. So that is a time-modulated display. And it is inherently slow. Go ahead.
What's the order of time you're talking about? You don't get any color shift from time then, I guess.
No, they're pretty stable positionally. They're unstable.
No, what I mean is the time that you leave each pixel on is not enough to give you a shift in color on the film.
Well, when you turn on the dot, this is a white phosphor, and you've got color in front of it, and then the color film, of course. So you can do the whole red pass. All right, then the whole green pass and the whole blue pass. So the time to do a picture is on the order of a minute and a half. All right, it's fairly slow. Now I'll talk about a speed up of that in a minute. The Selco is intensity modulated. The circle looks the same. Here looking down, I've got this cord hanging out, and see, lately I've cut out fig Newtons at night, and that was the big. I had this craving for fig Newtons. Well, I cut them out, and I lost a couple of pounds, and my pants are a little looser. And I keep thinking this is my belt out here or something. Sorry about that. All right, intensity modulated means you're going at a constant rate. Well, television's intensity modulated. I mean, you vary the intensity of the beam. Now, the theory behind the time-modulated one is that it is easier to control. Wrong. It's not easier to control. The way these people work is they have a very fine dot, and they only have one focus on the dot, and the thing is built for 4,000 line resolution. So if you want to make a 512 picture, that dot is repeated. And so it's repeated in a little pattern like this. Now, the hardware there builds the pattern into it for you automatically. You can specify what the pattern is. It's some rectangular pattern. And you, in fact, could specify one dot per pattern. That is, really make a 512 picture. But what you would see, if you looked at the picture carefully, is you would see the individual dots. And furthermore, you'd have a difficult time exposing the picture. If you have got this thing exposed all the way white, then holding the thing in longer and re-exposing it doesn't affect this area around it substantially. And so you don't get enough light. Well, the time on this is slow, so when we bought the box, we bought the number 2 box. The first one went to Livermore. We bought the second one. We wanted them to speed it up. So they sped the thing up, which meant, well, they jacked up the intensity, sped it up. And we discovered first that it did not expose the full dynamic range of the film. Color negative film, the kind that's usually used for shooting motion pictures, has got a dynamic range for each color of roughly 250 to 1. In other words, a full 8 bits. Most people using color recorders are doing it for scientific purposes for themselves, and they expose color positive film or color reversal film. The dynamic range of that is much lower. And therefore they hadn't noticed the problem. It wasn't until us crazy people trying to make cartoons used a different film they discovered that their dynamic range was low. Now, the way this box works is you give it an 8-bit intensity and it goes into a table lookup to convert them different 8 bits, but it's 8 bits in and 8 bits out. All right, so that's all you've got in this thing. Well, if you put in your 8 bits and you fully expose it, you found that your dark end is overexposed. And if you bring the dark end down, you haven't fully exposed the thing. And that required some tweaking on their part. But the unit wasn't nearly fast enough. It was still a minute per picture. Yes?
So what happens? You leave the shutter open and it goes doing pixel by pixel, and one pixel decays and it goes on to the next one? Or does it draw the whole picture and then you take the whole screen and then you take the picture?
No, you're in a light box. You open up. It's like the television here. It's just that it happens slower. You open up the lens and it paints across the thing once and it's done. All right, that's it. Now, the next thing we said to them was that you've got the beam over focused. We want to have a focus knob on it so we can take this little tiny pixel and make it larger, and when we can then jack up the intensity to make up for the light. So we're not going to burn the phosphor because we're still only laying down the same amount of light. But if we only have to lay down one dot, then we're going on the order of 16 times faster. It isn't quite that much. Well, they were very skeptical. The first story was that the focus circuit comes from the manufacturer and it was not changeable. And that wasn't true. And finally they said, well, we'll put in a knob for adjusting the focus, but it will void your warranty on that. He says, okay, do it. We want it. So they gave us a focus knob, and we defocused the beam so that the dots overlapped on the screen, and then ran it and then jacked the intensity way up, and made beautiful looking pictures, which we showed them. A few months later, we went to SIGGRAPH. We found that all of their new recorders had a new feature, which allowed speeded up pictures. The other problem we had with that device was it was not stable over time. Now, this is a difficult problem. You've got analog circuits which are controlling the intensity of this beam, and analog circuits vary over time. So you set the machine up to do a perfect exposure, and you come back a day later and you find that it's off considerably. Now, they had an approach of putting monitoring circuits all over the place to monitor the voltage and current levels throughout the machine, and you could hit buttons and you could find out what a particular voltage was. Well, unfortunately, there was not a direct tie-in. Oh, did the tape change? Yeah.
Here, not this last time, but the time before that, he gave a seminar.
When Alvy came and gave a seminar, he was talking about how one of your focuses at Lucasfilm was on new film recording technology.
Yeah, I'll talk a bit about that.
Maybe you could point out why this is bogus.
Okay. Well, first of all, on this stability, with all the knobs, or all the measurements they had, they didn't have anything which measured the light output. All right? And there was no direct tie-in with any of those currents or voltages with the amount of light. So that if the thing wandered, and of course there are knobs that you can set to, you change the grid current or whatever, you didn't have any number to bring it back to which would guarantee you that the light output was the same. So there was the standard calibration number. Well, just because it was set at 700, say, doesn't mean that if you come back in 2 days and you put it at 700, you get the same amount of light out. Now, it's not easy to do that, but it is doable. And there are ways of measuring those things with devices that are more stable. And it's not so much that they were errant in this, and they didn't know any better. They designed this whole thing, and now to come in and fix it is a major redesign. And so I bring this up because if you're involved in a position where you have to worry about this, then you should be aware that the only thing that really counts in these systems is the amount of light that comes out. That's what you want to measure. And you want to be able to set it back again so that you get the same amount of light out. See, in theory, with a time-modulated display, you only have one intensity of the beam, because it's either on or off. It's not quite that simple because there's a trail on each end of the thing. But essentially, the thing is on or off, and all you have to do is have the level be at the same place. And they were unable to do that. And that gave us considerable trouble. The actual way that we would calibrate it is to take Polaroid film and expose a step wedge on the Polaroid film. Now, Polaroid film itself is not very stable. But a fresh batch of Polaroid film, if it is fresh, is in fact more stable than that analog circuitry. All right, and that's sort of a measurement. You don't have to be perfect, but it's better to be to have something to measure the light out. With the intensity modulated, you of course have got the speed. It's just playing much, much faster. If you want the full dynamic range, then you typically don't want it going at video rates. That may be changing nowadays. There are now A to Ds and D to As, I should say, that are fast enough, and the circuit may be good enough that a good designer could have a thing which gave you the full range of what's possible in the system at video rates. Although typically with the Cellco, we went slower than that. Now, there's middle-end displays, which in the order of $100,000, and there aren't many of those. Cellco sells one. The world of business graphics is going up. I mean, with business graphics, people make lots of slides. And for that, a 100,000 display is really quite good enough. All right, now the low end. At the low end, we've got quality that isn't as good. There's a new breed of inexpensive film recorders just out recently. Let's see, their brand names are, one comes from Matrix, and the other comes from, gee, I've forgotten. Done. There you go. There we go. Now, the only thing they did, it's very simple, is they went out and bought a good Tektronix black and white tube at video rate, and put a camera on the back and a color wheel in front of it. That was it. And charged $10,000 for it. And you feed it video signals. It has to work on video, and you've got to be able to give it the red signal, and then the green, and then the blue. Now, they have gotten better, and I've seen some pretty nice pictures out of those things recently. The problem is if you just do it the very simple way, then you're going to get vignetting around the picture. There's pin cushioning or whatever all these distortions are. And the other is that it's very hard to see with your eye, but it's very easy with a camera. In fact, I'm not sure why it's so hard to see with the eye. But it turns out that as the beam sweeps across this thing, and you're looking at it, no, forget you're looking at it, because it's independent of you're looking at it. I mean, you can measure with a photometer over here. The amount of light for constant intensity beam falls off as you get off the direct axis. And it falls off with, I forget whether it's either the 4th or the 5th power of the cosine. All right, so there's this fall off, and then the result is, well, you can't see it here. If you take a picture, it looks dark around the edges. And those first systems were pretty bad in that. Now, they've gotten better. If you go out and buy a Dunner Matrix box now, they've got pretty square pictures. They've tweaked things up. The first ones that came out, you could obviously see the scan lines. And you don't want that. And they've taken care of most of those problems. I think they're fairly impressive. And for low-end stuff, it's a pretty good deal. In fact, I had another thing about the scan lines, although I'll talk about that during aliasing. You don't want to see the scan lines. If you're seeing scan lines in a picture, then you're seeing scan lines. And you're not supposed to see them. Now, the reason people do that is in the home market for a long time, people thought the television was focused properly if they went and they tweaked it and they had the thing with best focus. Well, it is not true. And then they go out and sit on the side of the room where they can't see the scan lines. What you're supposed to see is all the information that's there, and you don't want any extra artifacts. A scan line is something that is additional information that should not be there for the eye. They should be perfectly merged together. And it took several months to convince Dunn that they needed to put in a defocus circuit so you could have the thing focused properly. There are also homebrew units. I've seen quite a few of these. In fact, all my thesis pictures, and Jim's too, were done on a homebrew unit at the University of Utah. And every once in a while you hear of somebody doing it. They're not terribly easy to build, because if you're building a homebrew and it's because you're trying to be better than this stuff. Of course, at that time, these weren't even available. But you're trying to put out pretty good quality pictures. And there are a lot of things that can go wrong. You've got to worry about this fall-off, vignetting. You've got to worry about glitches in your DACs and noise problems. There are all sorts of things can be wrong. So I'm hearing about fewer and fewer of these homebrew units. Go ahead.
What's vignetting?
Actually, I might be misusing the term. I'm confusing two things. There's the fact that your edges of your screen are not square, not straight. And then there's the fall-off. And I think vignetting is really the intensity fall-off. And so I should have been saying barrel distortion. Is that what?
That's the barrel. That's where the picture changes its shape.
Yeah, there's a variety of geometric distortions. They've got different names. But what it amounts to is your scan lines aren't straight. All right? And plus the starting and ending points don't line up perfectly straight. Go ahead.
Do you have to have lenses? What if you make the monitor the right size? You don't have to have lenses included in the film. You get away. You have artifacts.
You mean if you just put the film directly against the face? Well, there's a separation of the glass, and you would lose focus. See, the lens is good enough that you can actually focus on the phosphor itself, and you wouldn't have that if you put the film against it. There is an approach to do that, and that is along a different path. And these are, I think, expensive ones. These are the EBRs, or electron beam recorders, where you put the film in the tube, so to speak. I mean, it's an exhausted chamber. You get the film in the tube, and then you hit it with the electron beams, with the electrons. There are commercial systems for that, but there are some problems with the electron beam recorders. One of the problems is that electrons are not colored. At least not at that level. I mean, the physicists, of course, have got some color. And therefore, if you're not doing black and white work, then you've got to make separate passes. It also requires a certain kind of film to work well. So that's one problem. The other one is that as the electron beam is scanning across the film, it builds up a small momentary charge. And the result is that you can't get very high resolution because as the charge builds up, it deflects the beam. All right. Anyway, that's the writing directly on film method.
So you get some kind of field effect at the surface of the film?
Yes. But on the other hand, there are also problems with even these high-end units, where the electron beam hits the phosphor. Well, the electrons bounce off and then go back and hit it again. So if you've got the intensity jacked up, you see the beam, but you also see this circle around it. So it exposes this broader path that you don't want. In addition, you've got light bouncing around in the cavity. Right? So in general, you've got things happening that you don't want to have happen.
Is the beam on even the high-end units, is that usually always a circle of some kind or a dot, or do they try to make, I mean, is it a constant intensity across, or do they try to square it, or what?
It's a Gaussian dot. All right. We had to make a choice about getting a film recorder. If we had to go out and buy a film recorder for writing onto film, our first choice would probably be the Selco. I might mention, too, there's a company called III, who does a lot of fancy graphics. You may have seen their stuff. Nelson probably talked about them. They have made fancy film recorders in the past, very good film recorders, and also very expensive. The size of the beam, or the dot on the face of the CRT, is roughly comparable to a grain of phosphor. And the phosphors themselves have a 15% variance in their size, which introduces this noise on top of things. And for some of their work, although you can't do it for film writing, you can for film input, they can actually compensate for that noise. In any case, we have considered that. But one of the problems that we've got with these type of recorders is that of the color crosstalk. You are producing a white light at the phosphor, or well, there's some spectrum, and it goes through the filter, and the filter the filters let light through according to some band here, and they overlap. And sure enough, if you heavily expose the blue, as you grossly overexpose it, it turns to white, because it's also exposing the other phosphors. So there's this crosstalk problem. And as you make multiple copies, which is something that we're interested in with filmmaking, going through the optical processes of special effects, you find that the colors become muddier as you go through them. And so one of the objects is to minimize the number of steps that you have to go through. So it puts a restriction that they would not normally have liked to have had. And that restriction, in fact, seems to strike or hurt faster than does the loss of resolution. Obviously, as you go through each step of a film, you lose a little bit of resolution, but you also lose the color, and the color goes away faster. Therefore, we've had to be concerned about getting stuff on film and taking care of the color. And we were aware that the various people had built laser scanners. Now, the laser scanner, you obviously pick off 3 frequencies that you want off of 2 or 3 lasers. And that's because you can only get so much color out of a laser. There are, in theory, white lasers, but they're not stable. Then krypton's got 1 color, and argon's got 2 colors, and you tweak and match. And in our case, we're going to use 3 lasers. So you pick out the 3 colors, and you don't have this overlapping problem. These are 3 distinct colors. Now, there's still some overlapping on the film, but if the overlapping happens in one place, you can actually compensate for it. And we'll discuss the compensation later. Now, what's the chief difficulty, then, with the lasers? Well, there are some difficulties that we haven't had experience with yet as we're trying to get this thing built. How stable are the lasers, both over the long term and the short term? As, for instance, there is a noise in the laser. And some lasers got a substantial amount of noise in them. Now, there are feedback systems to compensate for the noise. The chief problem, though, is that of deflection of the beam. If you're going to write on film, you must mechanically deflect the beam. All right, now, what is the problem with mechanically deflecting the beam? We really have got two directions to deflect the beam. And in our case, we don't want to move the film, although there are applications where moving the film is a good solution. It's a lot harder for movie film, especially if you must have frame-to-frame registration. We got a piece of film, and we're laying down a scan line here, and then the next scan line, and the next scan line, and the next scan line. Let us suppose that film was a linear device. That is, if you laid down twice as much light and then you developed it, and then you reflected light off of it, which you would normally do here with print film, it would reflect twice as much light. If that were the case, then if there were any variation in the spacing between these guys, it wouldn't really matter, because in any local area, the total amount of light that you're laying down is the same. But in fact, of course, film is not linear. And most of you may have seen what's called the Dillagi curve. That is, as you up the intensity of the light that you're sending, then the density of the film is going to change according to this curve that looks like that. Pardon?
It'll go down at the very top.
Oh, yeah, when you do something screwy. Okay, we don't usually go that extreme. But the point is you put on some light and nothing happens. And you put on a little bit more light and nothing happens. And then things start happening, and then there's this period where it seems to happen linearly. And then, in fact, a lot of people say, well, gee, let's just operate in that region. But you're not using the full dynamic range of the film. You don't have your blacks and your whites. So it's not a practical limitation. Now, as you put on more light, again, you find that there's a point where you're exposed, and putting on more light doesn't make any difference. Now, let's look at two scan lines. You got, well, a side view of a scan line. A scan line is this thing going down like this. And if we look at the side view, that's the number of photons laid down over this region of the film. Then the next scan line comes along, and it lays down this number of photons. All right, follow that? Well, and then here we've got this overlap between the two. Well, so the number of photons in this region is really the sum. It's going to look something like that. Well, if we change the spacing, like we move this guy over a little bit, then this sum might come up, and of course this whole thing moves over a little bit. Well, because it's the film that's doing the adding. I mean, the photons add perfectly, but the film now is adding in terms of what has been knocked off of silver halide atoms or whatever. Then the actual exposure doesn't add up exactly right. And the result is that if you have got even very little tiny noise in your vertical Y spacing, you can see it as horizontal striations in the film. And that's the problem with all these systems.
Even with
the high-end stuff, yeah. They all have it. The best that I've seen is Triple I, and very close behind them is Selco. And if you tweak things out and you take care to keep the noise out, it's actually pretty good. And it's good enough that you wouldn't notice it. With the Dicomid pictures, which we used a lot, we could always see it. We could never entirely get rid of the horizontal striations. Yes?
What resolution do you start picking these up?
It's actually resolution independent. Yeah, in other words, we did stuff at 4,000 line, you can see it, 1,500 line, 512 line. But there are things you can do. It turns out, and I don't know any theory for this, if you have your lines overlap a lot, then it diminishes the problem. But I don't know any theory behind that to say how much they should overlap to make that work right. And it is one of the things we're going to have to do with the laser scanners, to count on having to repeat each scan line twice to minimize that effect.
But are all the drugged kids out in the audience really going to be able to detect these? Nuances.
Well, actually, it turns out the ones we have to satisfy do care. You know, it's 5 o'clock. For some reason, I think we were going to 5:30. How'd I? Gee, I didn't even get through this stuff.